All right. I want to go back in the book and have a discussion with you guys. I haven't been able to give you any class lectures. So it's been very difficult to actually kind of help you out in having the class discussions we usually have. And I thought if I could wait until late at night, because most of you are awake late at night, I probably would speak in a language you can understand. So it's about almost 10 o'clock right now. Okay, so let's do this. I want you to get your book and look at chapter 8. And I want to talk about several things. We talked about this just briefly before you left. And if you look at the last paragraph in chapter 7, this is the beginning really of a lot of changes for Pip from this chapter 8. But it kind of kicks in chapter 7 because Pip is separated from Joe for the first time. And you notice Dickens is never really direct. We've talked about that. So he uses very intricate language, and you have to kind of figure it out. He'll walk you to the door, but you have to open it. He'll give you other keys, but you have to open it. So this last paragraph in chapter 8, Pepe is being taken away from Joe and Mrs. Joe by Mr. Pumblechook. Tomorrow, he gets to see Miss Havisham. This is the beginning of major changes. So Pip says, last paragraph, I had never parted from him before, and what with my feelings and what with soapsuds, I could at first see no stars from the chaise cart, but they twinkled out one by one, without throwing any light on the question why on earth I was going to play at Miss Havisham's, and what on earth I was expected to play at. Dickens here wanted to tell us that Pepe is emotionally devastated by being separated from Joe, so he cries. But notice he says he couldn't see the stars because of feelings and soapsuds which he had been washed with, so he couldn't see the stars. So when it talks about feelings, you know he's crying, okay? Now he goes to Miss Havisham's, and this is in chapter 8, and he meets Estella. I want you to look at page 57, and there's something here on page 57. Those of you who have a different book, the paragraph starts really very close in chapter 8, a few paragraphs in. The paragraph says, for such reasons, I was very glad when 10 o'clock came and we started for Miss Havisham's. Though I was not at all at my ease regarding the manner in which I should acquit myself under that lady's roof. Within a quarter of an hour, we came to Miss Havisham's house. And then the description of the house begins here. Dickens is trying to tell you something. Now, if you pick up the diction in this paragraph, you would notice something. Miss Havisham's house was old brick, dismal, had great many iron bars to it. Some of the windows had been walled up. Of those that remained, all the lower were rustily barred. There was a courtyard in front, and that was barred too. So we had to wait, after ringing the bell, until someone should come to open it, while we waited at the gate. I peeped in. Even then Mr. Pumblechook said, and 14? But I pretended not to hear him. And so that at one side of house there was a large brewery. No brewing was going on in it, and none seemed to have gone on for a long time. If you look at the language, the diction, we've done this before. If you close read this paragraph, you would notice one thing. The diction in it of old brick house, dismal, which is kind of a negative connotation, many iron bars. The word iron in this book has kind of an interesting memory to it. The windows are walled up and they're barred. The ones on the lower levels are barred. And then there's this gate. You can't get in, you can't get out unless somebody opens the key. What kind of place is that? Barred, the gate is locked, somebody with a lock and key, and the house is dismal and it's old and it's brick. And the people who live in there now we know don't ever come out. Dickens is trying to compare Miss Havisham's house with the prison. And now that you know Miss Havisham's lifestyle, she and Estella kind of stay here permanently. We don't hear anything about them leaving the house. So this is part of that story. And then, of course, Estella comes in. She opens the gate, kicks Mr. Pumblechook away, and then Pip walks in, and he meets Miss Havisham. And her name is, the house is also called, it's Manor House, like the animal farm, Manor Farm. And it's also called Satis House. It would be interesting to find out what the word Satis might have to do with the book. But I will leave that to you for now, okay? Now, I want you to look at a few things here. He meets Miss Havisham. He notices the time had stopped. And then Miss Havisham asks him to play. And then on page 62, there's a paragraph there that starts, to stand in the dark in a mysterious passage. Miss Havisham tells Pip to get out and call Estella. And watch how Dickens links her name with what's going on, okay? To stand in the dark in a mysterious passage of an unknown house. This is page 62 if you have the same book that I have here. Bawling Estella to a scornful young lady, neither visible nor responsive, and feeling it a dreadful liberty to roar out her name, was almost as bad as playing to order. But she answered at last, and her light came along the dark passage like a star. The name Estella means star, and she comes carrying a candle, so it looks like a star is approaching. What is ironic about this, now you know the story, is that when Estella the star shows up, she's full of darkness. She's not a very enchanting person inside. So, she's asked to play with Pip, and she doesn't like the idea, you know this. And something happens to Pip that is going to propel us throughout the rest of the book. She sat, this is page 62, she sat corpse-like as we played at cards, the fillings and trimmings on her bridal dress looking like earthly paper. I knew nothing then of the discoveries that are occasionally made of bodies buried in ancient times, which fall to powder in a moment of being distinctly seen, but I have often thought since that she must have looked as if the admission of the natural light of day would have struck her to dust. He calls the knaves jacks, this boy. This is the point, said Estella, with disdain, before our first game was out. And what coarse hands he has, and what thick boots. Notice the next paragraph on page 63. I had never thought of being ashamed of my hands before, but I began to consider them a very indifferent pair. Her contempt for me was so strong that it became infectious, and I caught it. So for the first time, Pip hates himself. A veil is opened before him, and he realizes something is wrong with him. Everything Joe has invested in Pip has been perfect. He's been very happy with his life. And suddenly, he hates himself. Which is funny, because he hates himself because somebody else doesn't like him. This is, by the way, very typical of people when they want to look like or be like somebody else. And some of you know that at one time, especially young people, you can hate yourself because other people have things you would like to have. And Estella has the same feeling. Now, I don't know where this would go in your theme tracker, that we just discussed. But Pip realizes social class. Okay, I'll skip the next paragraph. I'm not going to skip the next paragraph for a reason. Here it says. It says this. She won the game and I dealt. I misdealt, as was only natural when I knew she was lying in wait for me to do wrong. And she denounced me for a stupid, clumsy, laboring boy. If Estella earlier told Pip he was common and he believed it, and he had bad hands and he believed it and hated them, what is Pip supposed to do? If she calls him clumsy and stupid, you get the impression he believes it too, don't you? So that is, we are starting to analyze Estella's effect on Pip. This is way back in chapter 8, okay? Miss Havisham would come to the rescue of a child, but this is what she says next. You say nothing of her, remarked Miss Havisham to me, and she looked on. She says many hard things of you, but you say nothing of her. What do you think of her? Pip answers, I don't like to say. I stammered. Dickens knows what you would like to say. This is why he doesn't have to write it, because you are thinking it right now. Tell me in my ear, said Miss Havisham, bending down. I think she is very proud, I replied in a whisper. Anything else? I think she is very pretty. Anything else? Miss Havisham asking. I think she is very insulting. She was looking at me then with a look of supreme aversion. Anything else? I think I should like to go home. And then Miss Havisham asks this question, and never see her again, though she is so pretty? Pip's answer is important. I am not sure that I shouldn't like to see her again, but I should like to go home now. This is where Pip's obsession with Estella begins. The girl is rude to him, but he would like to come again and see her. Notice earlier, Estella is carrying a candle and like a star, and Pip is now starting to dance around Estella, who is a candle herself, like a little moth. You know the end of that story. Okay, here's something else. If you look at the rest of chapter 8, Pip, several of you would have asked this question if we had a class discussion. This is on page 67. There's this thing. Pip gets into the brewery and he sees this thing on page 67. If you have one of those big books, it may be page 26. I think I marked that before. But the paragraph says, it was in this place and at this moment that a strange thing happened to my fancy. I thought it a strange thing then, and I thought it a stranger thing long afterwards. I turned my eyes a little dimmed by looking up at the frosty light towards a great wooden beam in a low nook of the building near me on my right hand, and I saw a figure hanging there by the neck. A figure all in yellow-white, but with one shoe to the feet, and it hung so that I could see that the faded trimmings of the dress were like earthy paper and that the face was Miss Havisham's, with a movement going over the whole countenance as if she were trying to call to me. In the terror of seeing the figure, and in the terror of being certain that it had not been there a moment before, I at first ran from it, and then ran towards it. And my terror was greatest of all when I found no figure there. So Pip thinks for a minute that this Miss Havisham, dangling, hanging. And then he realizes, he runs away because that's kind of scary. And then he runs back and realizes there's nothing there. He just had a kind of a dream or a vision of Miss Havisham hanging. Now, why would Pip do this? One of the possibilities is Pip is so angry and frustrated and he can't get justice for himself. So he just imagines maybe Miss Havisham dead. We don't know. And it passes. And we have to get her from there. And Pip goes home, the 4-mile walk home. And that is the end of chapter 8. Now in chapter 9, there's something else very interesting here. Pip gets home and everybody is waiting for him to tell them what happened. And we all know, I'll be very short about this, Pip lies to them. Earlier, Pip stole. We know that. For the convict. He wasn't planning to steal. He didn't enjoy it. But Pip is a little bit different now. He is. He lies to them and he lies to them and he lies to them and he lies to them about what happens at Miss Havisham. In fact, he lies so much that he finally tricks Mr. Pumblechook into believing a lie. And then later on, Pip apologizes to Joe, page 73. After Pip has fooled everybody, he says, "Joe," says I, taking hold of his rolled-up shirt sleeve and twisting it between my fingers and thumb. "You remember all that about Miss Havisham's?" "Remember?" said Joe. "I believe you, wonderful." "It's a terrible thing, Joe. It ain't true." "What are you telling of, Pip?" cried Joe, falling back in the greatest amazement. "You don't mean to say it's—" "Yes, I do. It's lies, Joe. But not all of it?" "Why, sure, you don't mean to say, Pip, that there was no black velvet, eh?" For I stood shaking my head. "But at least there was dogs, Pip." "Come, Pip," said Joe persuasively. "If there weren't no real cutlets, at least there was dogs." "No, Joe." "A dog?" said Joe. "A puppy? Come." "No, Joe, there was nothing at all of the kind." As I fixed my eyes hopelessly on Joe, Joe contemplated me in dismay. "Pip, old chap, this won't do, old fella. I say, where do you expect to go to?" "It's terrible, Joe, ain't it?" "Terrible?" cried Joe. "Awful. What possessed you?" So we notice here Joe is very uncomfortable with Pip lying. But Pip has a little bit of a heart still for Joe, and he tells Joe the truth. He lied to everybody else, but not to Joe. Okay. And then Pip also tells Joe that I knew I was common and that I wished I was not common, and that the lies had come of it somehow, though I did not know how. So Pip started lying, kind of becoming a crook, after meeting Miss Havisham and Estelle. Why would that be? Why? We just need to notice at this point in the book that Pip becomes a liar and enjoys lying. Pip changes from thinking he is a normal person to thinking he is common, which is apparently not normal, after meeting Miss Havisham. Okay, and really, Joe tells him to pray when he goes to bed. And you get the impression maybe Pip feels that way, maybe he prays when he goes to bed, but something changes at the end of this chapter. At the end of chapter 9, when he goes to bed, it's a different Pip. If you read the last two paragraphs, he says, "When I got up to my little room and said my prayers, I did not forget Joe's recommendation, and yet my young mind was in that disturbed and unthankful state that I thought long after I laid me down how common Estella would consider Joe. A mere blacksmith, how thick his boots, and how coarse his hands. I thought how Joe and my sister were then sitting in the kitchen, and how I had come up to bed from the kitchen, and how Miss Havisham and Estella never sat in a kitchen, but were far above the level of such common doings. I fell asleep recalling what I used to do when I was at Miss Havisham's, as though I had been there weeks or months instead of hours, and as though it were quite an old subject of remembrance instead of one that had arisen only that day." the influence is so great on Pip going to Miss Havisham that he feels as if he's been there for most of his life. And he realizes Joe is so much more common than I am. Pip is referring to the fact that earlier he wrote something and he sounded very smart. So since Joe said he's educated, Pip is starting to realize, and this is not good, that he is superior somehow to Joe. Meeting Miss Havisham and Estella, Pip realizes Joe would not do for Estella and Miss Havisham. And then he says this in the last paragraph. That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me. But it is the same with any life, and Dickens gets philosophical here. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers, that would never have bound you, but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day. Pip is saying, if there was one day in his life that would be picked out as the day that changed his life, it would be this particular day when he met Estella and Miss Havisham. So, if you meet a boy or a girl and you feel as if you want to impress that boy or girl, and that boy or girl thinks you are common and low class, what do? Obviously, you'd have to change. You have to acquire whatever is necessary to be acceptable to those people you like. Chapter 10. If you turn there, Pip comes up with a plan to impress Estella. First paragraph. The felicitous idea occurred to me a morning or two later when I awoke, that the best step I could take towards making myself uncommon was to get out of Biddy everything she knew. If I get educated, I might impress Miss Estella and Miss Havisham. And the best person to provide an education to me, Pip thinks, is Biddy. In pursuance of this luminous conception, I mentioned to Biddy, when I went to Mr. Wopsle's great aunt's at night, that I had a particular reason for wishing to get on in life, and that I should feel very much obliged to her if she would impart all her learning to me. So Pip told Biddy, there's this reason. I won't tell you what it is. He doesn't tell her what it is. There's a special reason why I now want to be a really good student, and you need to teach me everything you know. Girls, how would that work if a boy came to you and asked you to teach him everything you know so that he can go impress another girl? Now, Pip doesn't say that, but that's what happens. So the paragraph on chapter 10, the first paragraph ends with Biddy, who was the most obliging of girls, immediately said she would, and indeed began to carry out her promise within 5 minutes. So Biddy gets to business right away to teach Pip so Pip can become uncommon. Are you okay with that? Is that okay? So there's that question. Now, I don't have to say very much after that. But Biddy teaches Pip for a long time, and that is mostly what is in chapter 10. But I want you to notice, okay, I want you to notice this in this book on page 79. This is chapter 10. I don't know what pages the other people's books would be, but here's this thing. This other gentleman, observed Joe by way of introducing Mr. Wopsle, is a gentleman that you would like to hear give it out, our clerk at church. Aha, said the stranger quickly and cocking his eye at me. The lonely church right out on the marshes, with the graves round it. And then a few lines later, skip a big paragraph and then later, I'm not acquainted with this country, gentlemen. But it seems a solitary country towards the river. Most marshes is solitary, said Joe. No doubt, no doubt. You notice in this book, Dickens uses specific tricks, diction, to keep the convict alive. One of those tricks is the mention of the marshes, is the mention of iron, and the mention of prison. So anytime we see the boats, marshes, river, there's that diction. That's when it comes, refers to the convict. So the convict has been around us, although he's long gone, and we are not dealing with him anymore. Dickens reminds us and keeps him alive by using language. And this is the chapter where Pip meets the guy with the file, and that guy is the guy who gives him money at the end. There's a little hint here. I want you to look on page 82. And it says this: nothing less than two fast sweltering £1 notes that seemed to have been on terms of the warmest intimacy with all the cattle markets in the country. Joe caught up his hat again and ran with them to the Jolly Bargeman to restore them to their owner. While he was gone, I sat down on my usual stool and looked vacantly at my sister, feeling pretty sure that the man would not be there. And he wasn't. Now, this man brings Pip some money and has the file. And this should be interpreted to mean several things. One, the convict is not dead. The government would have killed him, but they didn't. Why? We don't know. So several questions come out of this. Where is he? Because Dickens is trying to tell us he's somewhere. How did this guy know Pip would be here? Is Pip being watched? We don't know. But this guy had no problem finding him. The convict sent £2 and some coins. Do you remember Nicholas was making £1 a week, £1 a week? So this is more than half a month's salary for a medium income person. So it's a lot of money. What does that tell us about the convict? Wherever he is, he found some money. Now, he may have sacrificed everything he had, but he has some access to some money. And that brings us to the end of a section in the book. And I'm going to stop the video there because it's gone to 27 minutes, which I think is long enough for you to listen to me. In the next section, I'll talk about chapter 11 and chapter 12, because students have a lot of questions about this chapter. So I'm going to stop this chapter, and then I'll be able to talk to you about chapter 11 when we return. Okay, here we go.